Hello, my name is Patty, and I'm old now, but when I was young, when I was like you, my father had one of these. Now you see this thing, I know you probably never saw one, but this is called a last, and you couldn't even, it's so heavy, you couldn't even lift. It's made of cast iron, which is a very strong metal. The shapes here are for the shapes of the foot, and particularly this would be for a bigger foot, this would be the smaller foot, this is the heel. For mending shoes, mending or making shoes, this is what it's used for. My father used to mend our shoes because when we were young, you got one pair of shoes and they were leather and they had to last. Maybe that's why it's called a last, but the shoes had to last. You didn't get new shoes as often as the children do today. And from wearing the shoes too often, this part, a hole would come here because they were worn so often, or else the heel would wear down. And my father used to buy leather, like a piece of leather about this size, and it was about this thick, and he'd cut it to the shape of this, what he needed for the shoe. He'd probably do the heel on this part. You see the heel? He'd put the leather this size to mend the heel. Now these came in different sizes because people grow in different sizes. Like there'd be ones for adults, one for a child, and one for this would be the heel one. He'd cut the leather to this shape that he needed. And he had these tiny little tacks this size, little nails, and hammered them all around like this into it. And then he'd trim the ends, take it off and trim it to match the complete shape he wanted. And then he had this sort of it's like paint, but it was like a lacquer. And he'd neaten all the edges and put the paint all around here. So it looked great. And he had your shoes were repaired they'd last another long time again. And that's exactly what this is for. And most people had them. And actually, I was reading about it, and they're still used today. Shoemakers still use them. And people make shoes. They're very expensive, handmade shoes. What we buy in the shops are all made on, they've been made in a big factory. Everybody's working on them. But handmade shoes are made, particularly one person who's a craft for making shoes would make them. But they're very, very expensive to buy, and not everybody can afford them. So we buy our shoes in the shops. But years ago, you couldn't buy them, like you couldn't buy them in the shops because there were no shops years ago. So people had to make their own or repair what they had and make them last again as long as they could. But my father he always wore leather shoes. He was very fussy about them. He was in the army, so they were taught how to do everything, and he shine and rubbing until they were perfect, Well, if you got a new pair of shoes years ago, you'd be delighted because, you didn't get them very often. It's a big thing to get nice shoes. And like I said, today that sort of shoes, handmade shoes are very, very expensive because there's so much involved. And the craft is making them, they're made specially, and obviously the best of materials would be in them. Years ago, your shoes would go to your sister. When they were too small for you, your sister would get them, and that's the way it was. People didn't throw anything away. And then at the end of it, my mum would burn them because fuel was expensive too, So they were leather and you could burn them. You couldn't burn rubber today, but you could burn leather. But they'd end up in the fire at the end of the day, when there's nothing left of them, I remember that. The shoes today are made, they last for a while, but they don't last as long as the leather ones. So that means your mum has to go out and buy more. There's so much waste going into landfill that the environment is suffering from it, where they'd be better off making the quality thing that would last. I remember one time my mum told my sister and I, look behind the sofa, there's a surprise. And there was 2 pairs of sandals. And that was a surprise. We were delighted. Little sandals years ago. They were kind of a little shoe with a strap. There was a roundy part here and a strap coming up and a strap this way. And they were called sandals. I don't know whether they still have them today, but that's what we had. Instead of the leather shoe, you'd have a little pair of sandals for the summer, And you can get a new pair here and a new pair there anytime you want. Where they didn't have to wear them. We did till there was nothing left.